Today's daf is daf nun, round number 50. But we'll start on the last line on daf nun testament base. And the Gemara is asking about our Mishnah. Our Mishnah tells us that in a case where Succah coincides with Shabbos, and there was a mitzvah of Ushavta Mayim B'Sasam, of Simchas Beis HaShveva, to take the Mayim for Nisach HaMayim. So the Mayim had to be brought from the Meshiloach, in this particular case of Shabbos, on Erev Shabbos, in advance of Shabbos, to avoid any fuel Shabbos of carrying the water. And in this case, the Mishnah insists that we place the water that we draw from the Meshiloach into a Kli Chol that is not sanctified. And the reason for that is because if we take the water from the Meshiloach in a Kli Sharis, then it becomes sanctified the moment it enters into the Kli Sharis. Because we have a principle that the Kli Sharis is Mekadesh, it sanctifies anything that's inside of it. And now we have another halacha, principle called Psul Lina, which means that if you leave something that's Kodesh overnight, it becomes disqualified. So we're really in a bind. If we take the Mayim from the Meshiloach, we draw it into a Kli Sharis, as we usually do when it's a weekday, then what's going to happen is the moment that the Mayim enters into the Kli Sharis, it becomes sanctified with Kedushas HaGuf. And we're doing this on Friday afternoon. By the time we're ready on Shabbos morning for the Nisach HaMayim, the water became possible through the Psul of Lina. But if we take it into a Kli Chol rather than a Kli Sharis, a Kli Kodesh, then it's not sanctified until we take the Mayim into a Kli Kodesh, and that'll be on Shabbos morning. So there's no Psul Lina. So the Gemara says, V'amai nesi b'mekudeshes. The Gemara objects on the last line of Daf Mem Tes Amud Beis. And the Gemara is of the opinion that there are simple ways of circumventing this problem. You can take the water in a Kli Sharis, and yet the Kli Sharis would not sanctify that which is within it. Why not? For one of two reasons. There are two conditions that have to be met in order for the Kli Sharis to sanctify that which is inside of it. Number one, you've got to have the intention and the specific desire that the Kli Sharis should be Mekadesh. Without the intention, it's not Mekadesh. Therefore, we should be able to take the water on Friday from the Meshiloach in a Kli Kodesh, and we'll have in mind that we don't want the Kli Kodesh, the Kli Sharis, to sanctify the water within. Secondly, another condition is that you have to have exactly the amount that's needed for the Mizbeach in the Kli Sharis. Otherwise, the Kli Sharis is not Mekadesh. So why don't we just take, instead of 3 logim of Mayim, take 3.5 logim or 3.1 log, take a little bit extra Mayim, and then the Kli Sharis would not be Mekadesh. So we have a first answer in the name of Ze'iri. Omar Ze'iri Kasavar, our Mishnah is of the opinion that ain't Shir L'Mayim, although we require a minimum of 3 logim of Mayim, but beyond that is fine. You can have more than 3 logim. And therefore the Kli Sharis would not be, the Kli Sharis would be Mekadesh Mayim, even if we took more than 3 logim, because all of it, the whole volume, 3.5 logim, for example, would be sanctified. And then we have a Psul of Lina. Not only that, furthermore, says the Iri, our Mishnah is of the opinion that Kli Sharis Mekadshim Shalom Midas, that anything that goes into Kli Sharis automatically, ipso facto, becomes sanctified with Kedushas HaGuf, and therefore is vulnerable to the Psul of Lina, even in the absence of Kavanah. And now we turn to today's daf, which is daf Nun. The Maisi b'mekudeshes. Therefore, as the Iri finishes up by explaining the Mishnah, if we would take the Mayim on Friday with a Kli Sharis, then ifsalu lahu b'lina, the Mayim would become possible of Mizbeach through the Psul of Lina. And Lina means that you left the Kodshim overnight. Here you left the Mayim overnight. And it became Psul Lina. Why was the Mayim sanctified with Kedushas HaGuf? How did that happen? The answer is because we're holding, number one, that even more than 3 lugim can be brought in Nisach HaMayim. And number two, we're holding that there's no condition of Kavanah to have specific intention for the Kiddush in order for that Kiddush process to be effectuated. So the process of Kiddush would be effectuated automatically, and it would not help at all if we took more than 3 lugim, because more than 3 lugim is also fine for the mitzvah of Nisach HaMayim. And even in the absence of Kavanah, it would make no difference. The Kli Shareis would still do its thing, and it would sanctify the Mayim. Hence, we have no choice but to take the Mayim on Friday in a Kli Chol. Now, on the side, I would just point out that there's a problem with the Kiyar. You know that on a daily basis, the Kohanim used to sanctify their what's called Kiddush Yadayim Reglaim from the Mei Kiyar. And the Mei Kiyar certainly were filled with water on the day before. Why don't they become possible with Lina overnight? And there's an entire sugya in the Gemara in Masechet Yomi about how to avoid, circumvent this problem of a psul Lina in Mei Kiyar. They created a very complicated structure where they were able to keep the water sort of above the level. In any event, that's a problem in general. Now we have the second answer to this question. The truth is that they could have easily circumvented the problem of taking the water to Kli Shareis and avoiding the psulina, because you need das, and they didn't have das. But what would the spectator think? He doesn't know whether they had das or not. And therefore, Gzeira Shemiyomru were afraid lest the spectators come to the conclusion that Ladas Niskachu, the water was placed into this Kli Shareis deliberately with the intention of being sanctified in the Kli Shareis. And then what's going to happen is that they're going to start coming to the conclusion that there's no such thing as a psul lina. And therefore, even if we take the mayim in a Kli Shareis and we have intention to sanctify it, there's no problem of lina, because apparently lina is not a disqualification, because look what we did. We took it in a Kli Shareis on Erev Shabbos. And now on a weekday, we don't have a psul of lina. So in order to avoid a misconception on the part of the spectators, lest they come to the conclusion that there's no such thing as a psul lina when the water was taken into a Kli Shareis with the deliberate intention, we have to make a gzeira of shalom midas unto midas. And we have to prohibit taking it in a Kli Shareis shalom midas, even though then it would not be mekadosh the mayim, and we've avoided the problem of lina, in order to circumvent a possible hashash that maybe people would come to the mistaken conclusion that there was das and there's no psul lina. Now we have a third answer to this. Omer Rav Yanai, Omer Rav Zera, afilu tema yeshir l'mayim. Even if I assume that, number one, there's a precise shear, 3 lugim, not less and not more, which means we could have circumvented the problem of a Kli Shareis by simply adding more than 3 lugim. And that would not sanctify the mayim, because we need exactly 3 lugim. Number 2, Kli Shareis ein mekachem el midas. We could have easily circumvented this problem of Kli Shareis by having specific intention that the Kli Shareis should not be mekadosh the mayim. However, why then does our Mishnah insist that we take the water in a Kli Chol and not in a Kli Kodesh? Gzeira shemiyomru l'kiddush yadayim v'raglayim mil'an. Again, we're talking about the spectator, and he may come to the mistaken conclusion that this water was sanctified for the specific purpose of kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. Now let's explain. The Gemara now, in the name of Ze'ir, is holding that in event that there's no water in the kiyar for the purpose of kiddush yadayim v'raglayim, we could take water from any Kli Shareis. Any Kli Shareis will do as a fallback position. Now the spectator sees water in a Kli Shareis. He's going to come to the conclusion, mistakenly, that this water was set aside for the Kohen Gadol. And the Kohen Gadol has to prepare himself in advance, and he has to ready before Yom Kippur do Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. And they had a special vessel. It was a beautiful gold vessel, and they would fill it up with water and pour it over the Yadayim V'Raglayim for the Kohen Gadol to prepare him for the Avodah of Yom Kippur, which is the highest avodah of the entire year. And now the spectator comes to the conclusion that this mayim would sanctify. He admits that it wasn't necessarily sanctified for Nisach HaMayim, but he may come to the conclusion that it was sanctified for the purpose of Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, because the mayim for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim must be sanctified. It has to have a full Kedushas Haguf. And in order to do this, for the sake of the Kohen Gadol, they took the mayim into a Kli Kodesh, and the water is sanctified. Then at the end of the day, the Kohen Gadol was able to use other mayim, and they decided, well, let's realign this mayim, let's send it into a different direction. And the spectator again comes to the mistaken conclusion that they're using mayim that was sanctified for the purpose of Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. They're using it on the Mizbeach for Nisach HaMayim. They didn't need the water in this particular Kli because the Kohen Gadol found mayim in the Kiyar and so forth and so on for his Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. So now they think that this mayim that's being used now for the Nisach was mayim that was sanctified for the purpose of Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. Now, if they do this, they're going to come to the mistaken conclusion once again that there's no psul lina, because again it was on Friday that they took this mayim into a kli shares, and they prepared it and designated for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim. It was sanctified, and now it left overnight, and we're still using it for Nisach HaMayim al Gabi Mizbech. It must be there's no psul lina. So just to summarize the three different approaches to understand our Mishnah, why is it that for the Shabbos Nisach HaMayim, when Sukkot coincided with Shabbos, they would prepare the mayim in a kli chol? One answer is the answer of Ze'iri. And Ze'iri says that our Tana drops both conditions. Doesn't matter how much of a volume of water you put into the kli shares, it's always going to be sanctified by the kli shares. Number two, our Tana is of the opinion that kli shares is makadosh even shalom midas, even without intention. Then we have the second answer of Chizkiah. In truth, they could have circumvented this problem by having in mind that this kli shares would not sanctify, but the spectator doesn't realize that he thinks that the kli shares sanctify the mayim, and yet they're using it for Nisach HaMayim al Gabi Mizbech tomorrow with a lina in between. Apparently, lina does not disqualify mayim for Nisach HaMayim. The third answer, that of Ze'iri, is that even if I hold number one, that ein kli shares makadosh al midas. Number two, that it's only makadosh the exact volume of 3 lugim. So we could have circumvented this problem in two ways. But the gzeira was that the onlooker might think that we will makadosh this mayim in a kli shares for a different purpose entirely, namely for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim for the Kohen Gadol. And now we're up to Nishpacha o Nisgalso. Now the sugya that we're about to learn here, which is the last sugya in the fourth parak of Sukkah, is a sugya called Mayim Megulim. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. You know, if you go into, for example, Hasidic families, you'll see that the night before the morning, they prepare already, the mayim for Natil Sidayim, and they cover it over. And the reason they cover it is because of a psul called Mayim Megulim, which means that if water is exposed, then we're afraid that a serpent may have entered into the water. They had a lot of serpents. It was quite common in those days. And they hid inside Caleb very often, inside the wooden, or maybe the earthenware Caleb. And then these snakes would inject their venom into the mayim. That was a dangerous issue. So we had to make sure the mayim was mayim megulim. Otherwise, you don't use the mayim. That the mayim was not megulim, but if it was megulim, you don't use the mayim.
Is it true that the water would be poisonous, or that it's a tumah, or both?
I don't think there's a tumah issue per se, but I think there's a safety issue, and B, it could be that the Rabbanan made a gzeira. They didn't want to get into this whole dangerous situation, so they said these are mayim psul. And those who are makpid, even today when we don't have serpents around, they hold that the Rabbanan established it as mayim psul. You can't use this water for Natil Sidayim. Now, in the case of Yain L'Mizbeach, for Nisach HaMayim on Sukkos, if the water spilled, that's called Mishpacha, or alternatively Nisgalsa, the water was exposed, and as a result, it became Mayim Megulim, and it cannot be used as Nisa for Nisach Al Gabi Mizbeach, then he has to refill the water. And he's got to take the water from a Kli Kodesh. So the Gemara asks Aman, what are you worried about? You're worried about the eres, Aleph Reish Samach, the venom of the snake, Li Avid B'Misanenes. Okay, I don't know who made that sound of a snake. Maybe it was Mendel. What?
Yeah.
That was you, Mendel? Okay.
Yeah. I just joined.
But I don't see you, but I hear you.
Yeah, nice.
There you are. Okay. Okay. You look a little like Rav Avad Yosef. I mean, a living person with that hat and beard. And okay.
Yeah, I'm on the road.
Okay. You're on the road towards great things, great missions. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the Gemara is asking the following question: why not just take a misanenes, a sieve or a strainer, and just strain the water? Now, the Gemara is assuming that the venom has a thicker propensity than the water, so it would float to the top, and you can get rid of the venom. Why do you have to throw out the water? Throw out the bath water? The answer is leimastisin delo kirem nechem. Notice Reb Nechem is the one who's going to advocate the misanenes trick, to get rid of the venom. But the Tanakama, the price that we're about to learn, is not going to buy into this whole thing that you could sift out the venom of the snake. Isanya, we went to the Brisa, which means that the water is still called Mayim Megulim, despite the fact that he used the misanenes. And basically, the Tanakama is saying that once we passed the Mayim, because it was Mayim Megulim, we don't have any salvation. There's no way we can save the water. It remains Mayim Megulim, and we don't use it. Or Rav Nechemia says, wait a second. There's a way of guaranteeing that there's no venom in the Mayim. Now, keep in mind, this price that we're learning is not addressing the issue of Nisach HaMayim. This price is addressing the issue of Netilas Yadayim. And we need Mayim She'ena Megulim for Netilas Yadayim. What happens if the Mayim became Megulim? That's what I have. So the Shita of Rav Nechemia is that we have a possible solution to that problem. If you have one sieve on top of another and the bottom one is open, then you're not going to be able to find the venom. If you cover the bottom sieve in it, what they used to call those, remember those back in our youth, the pots that had two levels to it? What were those called? I forgot the name. Anyway, so you have so now that you have a situation where the tachton is mechusa, it's covered, then for sure, Rav Nechemia says the venom will flow to the surface of the top sieve, and we'll be able to get rid of it. In other words, in this case, we're not going to prohibit the water and parcel it and invalidate it by classifying it as Mayim Megulim. And he compares the eres nachash to a sponge, and the eres itself, this venom of the serpent, will float to the surface. It'll remain there so that you could just take it off. And in our case, in the Mishnah, there would be no need to substitute different water for the water that was Megula for Mayim, for the Mizbeach and Nisach HaMayim, because we have this very simple solution according to Rav Nechemia. And the Gemara says, no, I feel the Rav Nechemia, you can reconcile our Mishnah with Rav Nechemia. Eimer Diomar, Rabbi Nechemia lehedjot. Rabbi Nechemia's comment that you can be machshir the mayim and take away the psul, remove the disqualification of exposed water, that was in the context of netilas yadayim. That's called hedjot. Hedjot means for daily purposes. But when you're talking about using the mayim, in this case, mayim megulim, for nisach al gabi mizbeach, that's called ligavoa. Gavoa means for the mizbeach. Is then that's a different story. Miyama, we cannot commit Rab Nechemia to assume that mayim megulim could be koshered, but through the process of sinum, of sifting out the venom. Because once the venom goes into the mayim, we don't want to use that for the mizbeach. That's based on a pasuk which we'll quote right now. The Leslie, Rabbi Nechemia, the Gemara is asking it as a rhetorical question. Ki'ilu Rabbi Nechemia denies what it says in the pasuk. I think this is in Micha. No, this is in Malachi. And it says the following: Hakriveu na. Na means beautiful. Lefecha secha. Fecha secha is the person who's a sa, who's a moshel, and has dominion over. When you want to bring something to please the leader, then you're not going to bring him something that had venom in it. Ayirtzecha o ayisa panecha, Omar Hashem. Would it be that you can give such a low-quality gift to the king or to the governor, to the moshel, and here you're bringing this mayim for the purpose of nisach hamayim al gabi mizbeach, for the gavah, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu on high? In this case, even Rab Nechemia would consent that we're not going to do the sifting process and try to be machshir mayim begulu. And just to finish up this parak, I just want to mention to you that the whole process of nisach hamayim is all Kabbalistic. Sorry, it's going to be a little stuffy here, but I can't hear myself think. And we don't know much about Kabbalah. When I say me, I mean the royal we. But what I do know is that nisach hamayim coincides with Sukkah, simply because Sukkah is the time in which we pray for mayim, for rain. And in fact, starting with Sukkah, we're going to ask Hashem, we're going to praise Hashem, Hashem. And it seems that the entire process of Nisach HaMayim is a way of acknowledging God's dominion over the waters. And the tefillah, the prayer that sort of lurks under the surface of Nisach HaMayim is that the Mayim should go all the way down to the Tahom. You remember we spoke yesterday about the Shisim, and he pours the libation of the water into these holes, and it goes, according to the Chacham at least, all the way down to the center of the globe. And what that means is that the Mayim there, underneath the earth, is, so to speak, being stored for rainwater. It's going to somehow be lifted up to Shamayim. And this is all a matter of acknowledging the dominion of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that if you have Mayim Megulim and there's something in there that's repugnant, you don't want to tell me, okay, I'll sift it all out, I'll cleanse it up, and this is what I'm going to pour in the space. No. We want the best of the best. And the great simcha of Sukkot was always connected with Nisach HaMayim, Ushavte Mayim B'Sasam. And now we begin the fifth parak of Sukkah, and the last parak of Sukkah, which Mitzvah will start Beitza next week, and we're cooking the egg already. This parak, HaChalil, really goes back to the fourth parak, where the Mishnah had already mentioned that the water that is drawn from the Mei Shiloh for the purpose of Nisach HaMayim is part of a ritual that has simcha, that has joy as a very essential part of it. And the Mishnah had already mentioned that the Chalil, which I guess you translate loosely as a flute, would play, and we'll have to see who plays it, but it was played during the time of Nisach HaMayim. But not only during the time of Nisach HaMayim, what we didn't get to, which is later on in this parak, is that already the night before, they started the entire celebration of She'ivas HaMayim, of drawing the water from the Mei HaShiloah. And already at that point, the Simcha began. And if you recall, there was steps between the Ezras Noshim and the Ezras Hanoshim, and they would blow the Chatzotzos 3 times as they came closer and closer to the Nisach HaMayim. And this was all again to enhance the Simcha of this great moment. And part of that was the Chalil. Now, it's not just the Chalil, because the truth is that on every day of the year, it's not just on Sukkot, when they brought the Korban Tamid, they would accompany it with the singing of the Levim. That's called, get this down, Shira B'Peh. And then the Shira B'Peh, which you call the vocal singing, was accompanied by Shira B'Kli, Kli meaning a utensil, in this case, instruments. And there were a whole bunch of instruments. He may mention it here in the footnote. Let me just see. I know there were cymbals. Yeah, I'm not finding it right now, but there's a whole list of different instruments that they would play on a daily basis to enhance the Shiras HaLevim. But on Sukkot specifically, they upgraded this musical accompaniment by adding the Chalil. So the Chalil was only blown during these 7 days. And it couldn't even be 7 days, because if you remember, the maximum number of days that the flute was playing is 5 or 6. Now let's understand the difference between 5 and 6. If Shabbos of Sukkot coincides with the first day of Sukkot, then we'll leave out the Chalil only 1 day, and we'll be able to blow the Chalil 6 days. However, if Shabbos of Sukkot coincides with a weekday, let's just pick a day out of the hat, we'll call it Wednesday. So then we're going to have a Shabbos when we don't blow the Chalil, plus the weekday, which is Yom Tov. You follow me? So if the first day of Yom Tov is on a Wednesday, then there's no Chalil on that Wednesday, because Chalil is not Docha Yom Tov. And then from Wednesday to Shabbos, we'll blow the Chalil. On Shabbos, we won't blow the Chalil, because Chalil doesn't override neither Yom Tov nor Shabbos. So we'll have to reduce the Chalil to 5 days. HaChalil Chamisha V'Shisha, Zeh HaChalil Shel Beis HaShoev. And this is the great Simcha of Beis HaShoev. Eino Docha Los HaShabbos Below Es Yom Tov. And let's just formulate the principle that underlies this mission, and that is that avoda overrides Shabbos and certainly Yom Tov. But playing the instruments is not called the avoda, because the instruments and the music is only an accompaniment. It's, so to speak, tafel. It's secondary to the avoda of the Shiras HaLevim. And once again, only avoda per se overrides Shabbos and Yom Tov, but not a secondary kind of a key.